Good day and welcome to another episode of Drew's Book Reviews. Today, we've got a lot of stories to cover from Edgar Allan Poe's collected works. That's right, it's time for another Poe video here on the Year of the Poe on Drew's Book Reviews. If you want to hear what I have to say about this month's stories, stay tuned because that is coming right up. Alright, so Edgar Allan Poe, literary classic known for his tales of death, destruction, despair, and all kinds of dark thematic elements. So if you've been following along with this channel, you know this is the Year of the Poe, and I am also putting together, or have put together, a playlist for my Edgar Allan Poe videos. Be sure to check that out. I'll have that linked in the description below. And of course, I have other videos on Edgar Allan Poe in this series, which you could check out as well. So today's stories from the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe, we've got about 10 of them to cover. So this is going to be an interesting month of stories from Edgar Allan Poe's collected works. So we are starting off, our first tale from Edgar Allan Poe's collected works is the facts in the case of M. Valdemar. So if you have not read that particular story, it is the tale of a man on his deathbed. He is coming to the end of his life, essentially, and he is suffering in pain and agony. And our narrator hypnotizes this man to a state where he can no longer feel pain. The doctors are convinced he is going to die very, very soon. And this is the last effort to test his hypnotism theory on an individual, and he tries it out on this dying man as his last effort to ease his pain, which he seems to do quite successfully. However, all is not as it seems. So this story can definitely has kind of that dark, morbid feel to it. The descriptions of this dying man are definitely, he's described like a corpse and already dead essentially, and yet still alive. He is not breathing, and yet he is still able to speak. We're still able to hear what he has to say while under this hypnotic influence. So it's kind of crazy in that sense, and you know, right along the lines of that Poe feeling of that darkness that comes upon us when we feel that sense of impending doom. Just the description that Poe gets into, not only of the image and appearance of this basically living corpse. So it's almost like a bedridden zombie kind of thing going on with this, which just gave me the shivers when I was reading it, I tell you. And it was just really enjoyable. I love that aspect of Poe's writing where it really kind of gets into the nitty-gritty dark feeling of the story. And the very end of the story, when the hypnotism is released, what happens to the corpse, it just gives you the shivers. Definitely really enjoyed this one. Probably one of my favorite Poe reads for this month, the facts in the case of M. Valdemar. So all of Poe's stories, of course, are short stories. They're definitely not novel length, but that was definitely one that I thoroughly enjoyed. So definitely go read that short story, especially kind of like that darker feel and theme to things. The Black Cat is a tale of a man who loves animals, but is slowly driven insane by some dark force. So he grows up with a love for these animals. He grows up and kind of adopts a whole bunch of animals for his family, everything from monkey, dogs, and cats, and all kinds of animals. Now, he'd adopted this black cat at one point. Now, his wife was always convinced that black cats were of the devil or witches, essentially. Now, of course, he never believed this. He didn't think they were witches. It's just a black cat. That's a silly superstition, right? Right? Well, something happens and his mind breaks. He starts to go insane and derive this sick, sadistic pleasure from torturing animals, killing them, mutilating and maiming them. And then one day, this cat that he killed seems to get this kind of morbid revenge by bringing destruction to his family. But eventually this even drives him even madder and more insane, and he's got this overwhelming, powerful urge to just do these terrible atrocities. We don't know what's going on. He ends up killing his wife, becoming an axe murderer and burying her in the walls. So of course he thinks he's giddy, he's ecstatic, he thinks he's gotten away with this morbid crime until the police knock on his door one day, but he's still confident that because she's buried so effectively in the walls of his home that he's going to get away with this. He's just giddy and ecstatic. He is there trying to cover up his crime till one day, while the police are there, they hear the tortured scream of his dead wife in the walls. So this is really kind of that creepy Poe-esque feel to it. Something that we've come to expect from Edgar Allan Poe, with his storytelling and the way he paints his world, always kind of giving those creepy vibes where what we thought was dead is maybe going to haunt us and come back to bite us in the end. I just love that aspect of how Poe delivers that with this story in the Black Cat, and kind of playing off that idea of black cats being witches. It's really fun the way that that's presented within this story. And the Black Cat, definitely another one of those that I really enjoyed this month from the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe. And again, one I would definitely recommend checking, especially if you love that kind of creepy death occult vibe. So the next story we have is The Fall of House Usher. So in this story, the narrator tells us of his friend's descent into madness and despair, essentially. He is there to comfort his friend who's struggling with the death of his sister, essentially. And he is there to comfort him and try to bring consolation to his friend as his friend descends into madness. Now, his friend, Mr. Usher, is described as having a very corpse-like appearance. So again, that theme of death definitely strongly permeates this story with The Fall of House Usher. And as our narrator describes his friend's descent into madness, our narrator too becomes infected with this sense of gloom and despair that becomes overpowering to him as he listens to his friend's story. And at the end, we don't know what's going on. We don't really know for sure how things end necessarily for our narrator, but definitely focusing around those themes of death, despair, and gloom very effectively in the descriptions of this story. So yeah, it's just one of those things where you're kind of thinking, well, what's going to happen to our narrator? How are we going to overcome this? And will our narrator fully succumb to death and despair, or does he recover? We don't know if he ever recovers, because we don't get that part of the story. Poe's very good at not having happy endings. It's kind of one of the things he's known for. Happy endings just is not his thing. And that's awesome. That is totally fine and totally cool. That's part of what kind of makes Poe an interesting writer. Many stories always have that happy ending. Well, Poe doesn't like to end there. He likes to end with gloom and despair. And like the other stories in his writings, this one definitely fits that feel, that gloom and despair. So the next up we have is Silence, a Fable. This was a pretty short story. I don't really have much to say on this one particularly, but essentially it's this demon telling this fable and this story to a man who is basically lying in his own tomb. So again, we've got that element of death in there, but this time he's talking to a demonic entity within his own tomb. So it's like he's buried alive in his tomb and is conversing with a demonic entity who discusses things with terrifying figures and godly apparitions, and it's just kind of telling his own little parable within that. Don't really have much to say on that one. Other than that, it's a pretty short story, and just the concept of this demon having these discussions with a man in his own tomb in and of itself. It's an interesting idea, but I don't really have a whole lot more to say on that one, particularly for this month. But that's the basic gist of that one. So next up we have The Masque of the Red Death. So in this story, it discusses this fictional disease called the Red Death that sweeps the world, that is basically killing off half the population. Almost reminiscent of the plague, except it's called, instead of the Black Death, or it's called the Red Death, where you basically kills you once you're infected within half an hour and you bleed out and die on the floor. And it's just kind of that creepy, deathly, catastrophic disease sweeping the land kind of idea. And there's this rich prince who decides he wants to throw a ball in a masquerade for him and his buddies, because they have survived the Red Death essentially, and they have survived where others have not, and they want to have their own little party as the elite rich of the world, until one day a man shows up to this masquerade dressed as the Red Death, sending terror and fear throughout all the attendees of this, and the prince himself wanting to have the man taken and unmasked, but everyone's too afraid to do so because the Red Death has come for them all. And I think this is a really interesting idea, because I don't think it's about just a man at a costume party dressing up as the Red Death. You know, as I read this, I kind of think this is, you know, supposed to be representative of the fear or terror running through them, is that it's not a man dressed as Red Death that shows up at this party, but rather it's the Red Death itself starts spreading through those in the party, and everyone fearing and in terror and running for their lives as Red Death sweeps through the ball, and that the Red Death plays no favorites. It'll come for you. Love that idea there, and kind of definitely, even in Poe's day, seems to recognize that disease does not limit itself only to the lower class civilian population, but it will come for the rich, it will come for the elite. Kind of a, you know, interesting concept to read from a Poe story, especially with the current COVID pandemic we have going on right now. The idea that disease will run rampant through society. The Red Death, in this case the Red Death, will show up at your party, essentially. It's going to ruin your party. It's going to show up. Whether you want it to or not, it is here and it's coming for you. So the kind of ominous feel of that impending doom, with Red Death spreading through the population and through the rich and elite, just as it has through everybody else. I love that idea of time bomb. And of course, you know, like always, we've got that morbid fascination with Edgar Allan Poe, which makes it, I think the Tale of the Red Death might actually be one of my favorite reads from this month as far as the Poe stories go. I mean, just the image that brings is just, it's just crazy when you think about it. The image of this disease that causes you to die and bleed out on the floor, and just, bam, you're gone. So quick, so fast, so effectively. It's coming for you. Love it. Absolutely love it. Okay, so next up we have the Cask of Amontillado. So this is a story about a very precious wine that is very unique and very rare, and the Amontillado wine, and this man who is saying, hey, I've got this Amontillado wine for you. Come and get it, come and see it, come and taste it, enjoy this exquisite wine that is so rare. And he's guided into the cellars deep under this estate in order to try out and get a sample of this rare wine. Except that's not really what's happening. I mean, you didn't really expect Poe to just tell a story about a wine tasting, did you? I mean, come on. It's Poe. There's going to be something creepy going on, right? Well, of course, as we're going down into the cellar deeper and deeper and deeper, it becomes this crypt where these bones of people are stashed all throughout the crypt along the walls, and it just kind of starts to feel like this isn't really a wine cellar, is it? I mean, it doesn't really get that sense that it's a wine cellar. I mean, why would you have all these crypts and bones and dead bodies piled up inside the walls like a crypt as part of your wine cellar? But in addition to that, the kind of description of the pathway, of the dampness and the murkiness, kind of adds to that feeling of despair and that feeling of a pending death approaching you. So of course this tale does end with a living burial, essentially, which is very typical of Edgar Allan Poe. He loves throwing that kind of thing into his stories, in which, you know, I keep saying it, but I mean, that is the feel of Poe. That is Poe. Death, destruction, despair, living burials. These are things that he's famous for. And they're definitely things that make his stories interesting and classic and continue throughout this day. So that is essentially the gist of the Cask of Amontillado, as we see our character slowly walk through this cellar that's supposed to be a wine cellar, but really has more of a crypt feeling, and the inevitable living burial that happens with our characters. All right, so the next up we have the Imp of Perverse. This one is a pretty simple story. It's about a man who is tormented by the guilt of his crime of murder, and I don't really have a lot to say about that, but he basically goes on throughout this story about how we all have this inner desire to do wrong, how we all have this inner desire to break the rules and go against them just for the sheer point of going against those rules. Just because the rules are there, we want to break them. We want to go against what we know to be right. We're driven by this desire to go against those ideals. And that when we finally reach that breaking point, we do this terrible, horrible thing. So we are then ridden with guilt, and this man is tortured by the guilt of his murder. He wants to blab it to the world and tell the world, but he's also afraid to do so because I guess he's afraid of those potential consequences for admitting his guilt and spreading that to the world. Essentially, but he's driven mad by insanity, by the guilt of what he has done. So he talks about this being, this is my perversion. This is what is hobbling me down. This is what is making me struggle. And this is my perversion, this guilt that racks my soul because I have this overwhelming desire to do terrible things that I know are wrong, but I'm driven mad by the guilt of that as well. It's kind of an interesting take on that. Definitely a very negative ideal of psychology in the individual, but definitely well in line with Poe's style and ideas within his stories. So the next up that we have is called The Island of the Fae. So much of this story is a description of the isolated island, essentially, that a man happens to stumble across on his adventures or wherever he's there. We don't really know what he's doing there in the first place, but he stumbles across this island called the Island of the Fae. And it's described as basically an island that's half Garden of Eden, essentially, and the other half is this basically dead island. It's death and destruction on the other side. So it's got the two halves balanced against each other, and it's the description of this fae or this fairy creature that lives on this island. And there isn't much more to say about that, but that's the gist of the story itself, is the Island of the Fae, half dead, half alive island, and this fairy creature that lives there. Then we have the Assignation or the Visionary is up next. So this entire story is about collecting art. This man is talking about his art collection, the different pieces, and how they appear. We get a lot of descriptions about the artwork itself throughout this. So, with Poe, you know that something's got to be coming, right? I mean, something has to be coming up here because Poe is not known for simply writing descriptions of art. But the man's talking about all these different art pieces, how they're inspired, how great they are on his estate, and why they're there, where he collected them, what he likes about them. Essentially, so he's going through this man's estate as this rich man in Italy, talking all about these things. And then there's the final twist at the end. Look, if you haven't read Poe yet, you should read Poe, and if you have read Poe, you know what kind of twist is coming. I mean, come on, it's Poe. So what you have here is the twist at the end is the wine that they're consuming has been poisoned. That's kind of how it ends. It ends with a death and our narrator going, oh crap, if he was poisoned, I've been poisoned too. And it ends there. So the whole time we're talking about the art, as if nothing is wrong, and then bam, he hits you with that death at the end. Just in a way that you didn't expect that to happen. I say didn't expect, but this is Poe. Of course you expect something's going to happen. But just the way the story was written, no indication that there's anything wrong. And then bam, you're hit with the death right at the end. Literally the last, paragraph. Done. That's it, story's over. Move on, nothing more to see here, folks. It's like, wow, that just completely flipped at the last minute there. And just kind of hit you. So, typical Poe. But like I said, if you know Poe, you got to expect this kind of thing to happen. It's not something that you can seriously read Poe and not expect to happen at the end of the day, right? And then the final story for this month is probably one of Poe's more famous stories, and this is The Pit and the Pendulum. So this is the tale of a man who wakes to find himself imprisoned in this pit of utter blackness and darkness. He can't see where he is. He doesn't know how he got there. And he just wakes up and seems to be imprisoned in this death trap. And it's not just the fact that he's imprisoned in this. Of course, he's lacking any proper amenities. He doesn't have food or water except for the occasional food that seems to be thrown down to him. This pit is full, it's damp, it's wet, it's dark. It's full of rats that are wanting to eat him alive because the rats themselves are starving. He gets these, pieces of bread and some water on occasion. He's being kept barely alive for who knows why. And it just kind of goes through the cycle of his mind of, him trying to get, between sleep and wakefulness, and how he finds himself trying to figure out his surroundings and where he is, how he got there, what is he doing there, that trapped in this pit. And one day he wakes up to find himself strapped down, being held tight with this swinging pendulum with this blade coming towards him, and just kind of swinging back and forth as this tortureful experience that not only is he facing impending death from this pendulum that's swinging down across him, but also the rats are trying to eat him alive. And as this pendulum is taking these small cuts out of him, he's being eaten by the rats. And it's just kind of this creepy feeling vibe throughout the entire story. Like, this is nuts. I mean, how does somebody live like that? How does somebody go through that experience without being driven mad and insane? And he has no idea why he's there. He's trapped in this position of being tortured, effectively. And just the creepy, dark, disturbing vines that come with the pit and the pendulum and the feels behind it. It's just so classic Poe. I love it. Love those feelings that come with that. It just really strikes you and really kind of hits you and gives you the creeps, and the way that this is all described throughout this story. Just Pit and the Pendulum is right up there with my favorite Poe reads of the month for sure, along with The Black Cat and the Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. All those were really good ones for me this month. Those are probably my 3 favorites for this month in terms of my Poe reads. And definitely, if you haven't read Poe and you like this kind of idea, you'll like this. Why haven't you read it yet? But hey, maybe this isn't your alley, and that's fine too. So those are the 10 stories by Edgar Allan Poe that I read this month that I really enjoyed. Well, the 10 stories I read, and some of them I enjoyed more than others for sure. Some I didn't have a lot to say about, and that's totally fine and okay as well. So those were the stories that I had for Edgar Allan Poe for the month of April. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You could follow me on Instagram and Twitter. It's where I'm primarily active. You could join me in the Discord. I will have the link for that linked below. You can also join me on Patreon if you like this type of content. Or if you like what I do here, join me on Patreon. Little as $1 per month. You do get early access to my videos. And you could even pick my next read if you want to join me over there. So thank you so much for watching. Do appreciate it. And we will see you next time on the next episode of Drew's Book Reviews. Until then, keep on reading. Bye.